Redfall is an open-world first-person shooter that combines mechanics-driven, immersive sim-style design with optional cooperative multiplayer. It promises a vast, Unreal Engine 4-powered world to explore while casting aside the shackles of the last-generation Xbox One hardware with the release exclusively targeting Xbox Series consoles and the PC. Alas, things have perhaps not gone quite as planned. It started shortly before release, where, in a controversial move, it was announced that the promised 60 frames per second performance mode would not be available for launch on Xbox consoles, leading to a minor tempest in a teapot over this decision. Then, reviews dropped, and it became clear that most critics were not especially happy with the quality of the game, to put it mildly. My own experience has been somewhat more positive, which I'll discuss later in the video, but first, I want to address some of the questions surrounding the game, including how well it runs and plays at 30 frames per second on Xbox, highlighting what the game gets right and wrong from a visual perspective. We'll discuss the numerous bugs and issues I encountered during my playthrough, and there are a lot, while also comparing Xbox Series X against its little brother, the Series S. So let's get into it. Redfall is the latest game from Arkane Studios Austin, the creators of 2017's phenomenal Prey. Over time, Arkane has increasingly become one of my favorite game developers in the business today, specializing in immersive sim-style first-person experiences. Redfall, however, is a little different. While solo play is possible, this is a game clearly built with multiplayer in mind. Redfall delivers an experience more reminiscent of Far Cry blended with a looter shooter like Borderlands. The game is structured around a firehouse where you mingle with NPCs, upgrade your gear, and choose your next mission. Once selected, you'll head out into the city where you'll work your way through the greater Redfall area in pursuit of your objectives while sneaking or shooting along the way. With its multiplayer focus and open world design, it's clear that a change in engine was necessary to bring Redfall to life. While Arkane Lyon has focused its effort on the suitably impressive Void engine, Arkane Austin's previous project Prey was built on CryEngine instead. That is until the Typhon Hunter DLC, which uses Unreal Engine 4, no doubt owing to its multiplayer and VR functionality, both of which Unreal excels in. So yeah, Arkane Austin has some Unreal Engine experience. Unfortunately, when it comes to delivering vast open-world environments, Unreal Engine 4's reputation has been tarnished in recent years, with games such as Gotham Knights and Jedi Survivor exhibiting poor performance, visual inconsistencies, or both. So how does Redfall fare? Well, the results are mixed. Redfall presents a stylistic take on realism, much like the Dishonored games before it, but with an East Coast American setting and a small-town suburban aesthetic. Cape Cod and colonial-style homes dot the landscape alongside the fiery red autumn trees. Characters are stylized and expressive, while weapons are neatly rendered, boasting slick animation as each shot pops off. Many of the key mission areas feature the attention to detail you'd expect from Arkane. From haphazard stacks of CRT monitors linked by a rat's nest of cabling, to ominous wooden structures precariously teetering above the player, all the way to waves frozen in time along the coastline. There's a lot to like here. As in many other open-world games, Redfall features a dynamic time of day system with an appropriately dynamic shadow map that changes based on the angle of the darkened sun looming above. Speaking of above, the game makes use of a nice volumetric cloud system that looks excellent and helps enhance the mood as you explore Redfall. From a distance, the world of Redfall holds up surprisingly well. The map is easy to parse with visible landmarks dotting the landscape, while screen space shadows help unify everything. Other nice touches include the sinister volumetric red mist you'll contend with during your journey, and some rather detailed texture work, though more on that in a moment. Alas, while I dig the aesthetic, Redfall exhibits a multitude of visual flaws which detract from the experience. For this section, I'll be examining the game on Xbox Series X, with Series S comparisons following directly after. Got it? Okay, the first and most egregious issue with Redfall on Xbox involves the textures. Now, texture pop-in goes hand in hand with Unreal Engine if not managed properly, so I wasn't entirely surprised to encounter it. What did surprise me, however, is the severity of the issue both in terms of frequency and persistence. What do I mean? Well, for starters, this primarily seems to apply to layered textures or decals such as blood pools, graffiti, signs, and more, though there are exceptions to this as well, of course. One of the first examples you may encounter can be found directly within the fire station, this Redfall Fire Department emblem decorating the main hall specifically. No matter when you approach this surface, the resulting artwork is always displayed at this obscenely low resolution, lacking all detail. But if you sit and wait for upwards of 20 seconds, the proper texture will eventually materialize. But if you turn around, walk into the adjacent room, then return to the emblem, it reverts to the lower quality asset for another 10 seconds or so. The problem here is that it happens everywhere across the game. I encountered the same issue across multiple Xbox consoles, and all of them had the game installed to the internal drive. I also did a fresh boot each time. The painted yellow caution stripes near the fire engine? Yep, same problem. Graffiti decorating the mansion of a deranged antagonist? Absolutely, you'll find the issue. There is some variance in the amount of time you'll wait for textures to load, but it occurred on all systems. Just like the fire station, you'll need to stand still and watch the graffiti as it slowly loads into memory. This is what you'll see most of the time if you pay close attention. How about blood decals following a firefight? Yes indeed, and in fact in this case, I spotted the issue and was attacked by a vampire while attempting to capture it. Once I defeated the vampire, I returned to my texture observation, only to find that it took a further 20 seconds for the texture to even load properly. The same thing happened in the mansion with another piece of graffiti. I was attempting to capture the scene, was interrupted by an enemy, and was dismayed to discover that the full resolution asset had not yet loaded by the time I vanquished them. And how about these white painted crossing lines just adjacent to the fire station? I guess we shouldn't cross until the texture has loaded, just to be safe, right? Heck, even surfaces that appear fine at a glance still load in a slightly higher resolution asset if you wait in place for just a moment. It's wild. It's basically the worst texture pop-in I've seen since id Software's Rage. The textures are constantly changing based on the camera position, and it takes a long time for many of them to load in, if they load in at all. Because you see, that's another problem. Some texture assets are just low resolution no matter what. The game's tree trunks, for instance, exhibit a shockingly low resolution asset slathered across their surface. Even Halo Combat Evolved from 2001 features higher quality tree textures. Of course, as I noted earlier, there are some decent textures in the game that do display correctly at all times. The grass looks excellent, for instance, but far too often during normal gameplay, you'll spot low-resolution assets around every corner. It detracts enormously from the presentation, and it needs to be patched. You'll even spot these issues during the game's many cutscenes. I mean, this just is not acceptable, I think. Especially for a console with storage this fast. And just to be clear, this is a problem with Redfall, not the Xbox hardware, so I don't want to see anyone trotting this out for use in console warfare, okay? Alas, there are some other issues to mention as well. Shadow quality is unacceptable throughout. The game updates its shadow map position on a per frame basis, according to the angle of the sun, which is nice of course, but the poor resolve produces severe visual artifacts in the process. This scene is particularly gnarly, I think, as the fire station emblem slowly loads in, the low-resolution shadow crawls noisily along the back wall. Lighting is also questionable at points. The lack of proper, dynamic, indirect lighting is painfully obvious in this game, especially when interacting with the various characters throughout the world. Speaking of characters, I mentioned earlier that they were expressive. And that's true to an extent, but when it comes to actual storytelling, Redfall falls woefully short. When speaking with NPCs around the fire station, for instance, each character exhibits minimal animation flourishes as they rattle off their spoken lines. In-game story sequences are presented almost exclusively through these ghostly visions of the past, which serve as little more than a visual audio log. Lastly, cutscenes between missions utilize these real-time yet almost completely static panning shots mixed with voiceover. It almost feels like a nod to the classic Thief games, but not nearly as stylish. So while the in-game animation and select sequences can look pretty good in motion, much of the storytelling falls flat. Another issue, the artificial intelligence exhibits unexpectedly poor behavior and often breaks during normal play. Now, AI is tough to get right, something that is especially true when attempting to support both stealth and shoot-bang style gameplay, but Redfall really falls short. Sometimes your foes will remain unaware of your presence entirely. They'll bumble about the scene, mumbling to one another, but never actually attack the player, even as you wipe them out.
Show yourself. That was my friend, you asshole! Give me a second chance!
In others, enemies may simply stop fighting entirely, choosing to instead enter a docile state, awaiting sweet mercy.
It's no use! It's no use! This isn't good. It's no use! Ah!
Even when they are working correctly, the behavior feels rather inelegant. It's difficult to play a stealthy character as foes are either overly sensitive to your presence or not sensitive enough, removing any sense of immersion. Even small details like these functioning sinks aren't even properly set up. In many scenes, the water surface used is slightly rotated within the engine and no longer aligns with the sink model. Then there's the bugs and the unexpected. From motion blur disabling itself in certain scenes like this, something I'm sure many won't shed a tear over, to the fun ragdoll glitches that can occur throughout the game, which really, I always enjoy. In one scene, the character's running animation got stuck so that even when walking around slowly or just standing still, the player weapon could be observed swaying back and forth as if sprinting at full speed. Even firing your weapon failed to end this animation loop. But sometimes these bugs could be frustrating. One example, while completing one of the earlier missions, I suddenly found myself unable to crouch or press the start button. Normally you tap B to crouch, but in this state the game would simply play a sound effect like this, and then proceed to not crouch. No matter which buttons I pressed, the crouch function would not activate, which locked me out of certain areas in the mansion. I had to reboot the entire game to fix it, which cost me mission progress. I also encountered a multitude of objects that seemed to lack any sort of collision properties, begging the question, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody's around to see it, can you still clip through it? In Redfall, the answer is a resounding yes. Oh, and this isn't a bug, but since this game, at launch at least, requires a server connection, you'll find yourself unable to rely on quick resume. This is true of any multiplayer game, of course, but it's worth noting. Honestly, the list just goes on and on. There are so many issues like this which crop up throughout the experience that one cannot help but feel that the game simply needed more time. Arkane's console games have unfortunately often launched with technical hiccups in the past, but Redfall is the worst offender to date, which is a real shame. Alright, with that out of the way then, let's talk about performance and image quality across the two Xbox consoles. With this release version offering only a quality mode capped at 30 frames per second on Xbox, it should come as little surprise that image quality is, at least, pristine. As promised, Redfall delivers a native 4K image combined with TAA on the Series X, while Series S opts for 1440p instead. Dynamic resolution scaling is certainly possible, but I never noticed this during any of my pixel counts, which is unusual. So at the very least, the image quality remains very sharp throughout. It's not perfect, of course, as shimmering can still occur in certain spots, but overall, I'm pretty happy with the way it looks. When the game's textures are loaded properly and everything is in motion, it can be quite an attractive game. Beyond screen resolution, however, there are a handful of visual differences that separate Xbox Series X from the Series S. Firstly, screen space reflections are disabled on Series S during gameplay. Puddles, reflective floors, and pools of blood alike all lack that additional sheen you get on Xbox Series X. Given how lightweight Unreal Engine 4's SSR can be, I'm surprised they've disabled it on the S in its 30 FPS quality mode. Weirdly enough, SSR is enabled during these cutscenes specifically, but it's the only time you'll notice the effect in use on the lower powered console. Then there's the shadow quality. Despite the already low quality shadows on Series X, the Series S version sees a further reduction in resolution. This results in even more egregious visual artifacts when shadows are projected across the scene. Unfortunately, every version of the game has the same limitation in terms of how far shadows are drawn out into the distance. Shadows projected from lights only appear when the player is near the light source. Note how as we approach this door, shadows that were absent suddenly appear. Unsurprisingly, it uses lower resolution textures across the board as well, no doubt due to the reduction in available memory. The weird thing about these textures is that in some cases the Series S manages to load its textures faster than Series X, but the texture quality itself, once loaded, is still lower than anything we'll see on the Series X version. In select circumstances, however, certain objects such as these fallen trees resting near a sewer grate during the game's introduction remain inexplicably low resolution on the Series S. It looks completely broken in my eyes. So basically, Series S owners can expect a reduction in fidelity on top of the already lower resolution. But then we come to performance. Yes, in this version of Redfall, the frame rate is indeed capped at 30 frames per second. This was expected. The question is, does it actually retain 30 frames per second, and are there any issues with frame times? Due to the lack of matchmaking, I was unable to sample the full 4-player experience in Redfall, but thankfully, Oliver was kind enough to join me during a single session. The average level of performance seems to be consistent between single and multiplayer modes, based on my experience at least, but it is possible that you could encounter additional dips when 4 players are active, so keep that in mind. I've seen reports of massive slowdown and huge dips, and I don't doubt that some of these can occur, but after hours of gameplay, I encountered only a few specific issues. Otherwise, it's a very stable 30 frames per second with correct frame pacing. So what are those issues? Well, firstly, there's traversal stutter. This occurs when moving between different sections of a map. It's a side effect of how Unreal Engine 4 handles open world environments and occurs on every platform, including the PC. This manifests as a minor hiccup or disturbance of the frame time graph during map traversal, as you see here. Secondly, in scenes filled with transparency effects such as smoke and fire, the frame rate can dip significantly as long as these effects remain in view. This includes the volumetric red mist that can emerge during battle. Engaging the enemy in or around this mist absolutely tanks performance. Xbox Series S in comparison fares slightly better, perhaps as a result of its lower rendering resolution and lower resolution volumetrics. This same scene and others like it run mostly fine on the Series S in comparison to Series X. In fact, performance in general is very smooth on this system. But of course, Arkane has promised a 60 frames per second mode down the line. I suspect the reason the game shipped without it is down to poor threading and handling of CPU related tasks. Based on the PC version, we're seeing poor CPU utilization, much like other open-world Unreal Engine 4 games. As a result, even just lowering the resolution likely would not have been enough to reach 60 frames per second without major optimization work. Alas, given the buggy state of the game at launch, one has to wonder when they'll have the time to complete this optimization work, and if this will impact the arrival of the performance mode. Unfortunately, it's not just the visuals that have issues, the controls also fall short. The default settings on Xbox feature a huge dead zone and poorly adjusted aim acceleration, which, combined with the lower frame rate, leads to a distinctly unresponsive experience. Now, I did manage to improve that experience by setting the input response preset to the low setting while keeping aim sensitivity at 2.5. It's still suboptimal with this setting, but at least it becomes a lot more tolerable. Now, the last thing I'd like to discuss briefly is the game itself, and this is a tricky one, because early on I was intrigued by the game. It seemed to successfully combine immersive sim-style design with an open-world shooter, but the more I played and replayed missions, it all started to unravel. The first problem lies in the game world itself. On paper, the idea of moving to an open world design has a lot of potential. Imagine a densely packed Deus Ex style hub world full of obstacles and intricately designed structures just begging the player to explore, slowly peeling back the layers as they progress. Redfall's landmass is small enough that this idea could have worked, and that's kind of what I expected. Unfortunately, most of the world is devoid of anything resembling gameplay. Between objectives, you rarely encounter enemies or NPCs or even anything of value. It's all just set dressing that completely wastes its immense potential. Primary missions at least suggest some modicum of creativity. You'll be asked to infiltrate structures, uncovering further exposition and completing objectives, and these structures are often densely packed with corridors and rooms featuring multiple points of infiltration. You might use a lockpick to unlock a door, or perhaps find another way to drop in through the ceiling instead. Classic stuff. The problem is, outside of select instances, mission progress is often locked behind specific objects such as keys, buttons, or some other MacGuffin. Case in point, one of the earlier missions involves an infiltration of this large estate. The manor is surrounded by snipers and boasts multiple points of entry. This is prime immersive sim potential, but it falls flat. You see, once inside, the manor is filled with vampires, but due to the limited AI and poor stealth mechanics, you'll find yourself engaging them head on more often than not, removing the potential for a proper stealth run a la Thief. In fact, vampires are most easily defeated by simply punching them in the face over and over again. Once dispatched, you'll then locate your objective, and the rest of the mission basically turns into a hidden object game. You'll need to find keys to unlock certain doors while hunting for doll statues, which eventually unlocks a pair of visual audio logs, and that's it. The potential of the mission is fully squandered. So while maps can offer multiple points of entry, most of the time it boils down to just hunting for objects and sloppily killing foes. Now, as silly as it sounds, despite missing its potential, I have to admit that I still did have some fun here. Pair up with a friend or three and expect a night of silly entertainment. Even with the item gating, the mission areas were still fun to explore and fight through, so it's certainly worth a shot. I also wanted to briefly mention the similarities to Epic's Fortnite and what it means for the future of open world games powered by Unreal. You see, beyond the East Coast aesthetic, Redfall features these barriers which are visually reminiscent of Fortnite's storm circles, in addition to the exaggerated characters and painterly textures. The key here is that this highlights the potential of Unreal Engine 5 for open world multiplayer games. I covered this back in December, but the current version of Fortnite takes full advantage of UE5's Lumen and Nanite features, allowing for a much higher level of micro detail without any of the nasty pop-in we see in Redfall, plus robust global illumination. It wipes the floor with Redfall from a technical perspective, and even runs at a stable 60 frames per second. So while every game is ultimately different and not really directly comparable, the point is here that in an age where nearly every Unreal Engine 4 powered open world game is running terribly across all machines, Fortnite's UE5 update gives us some hope for the future. In the here and now though, despite having some fun, I came away from Redfall ultimately disappointed. Prior Arkane games have easily made their way into my top 10 games of their retrospective release years, so my expectations were pretty high, but Redfall doesn't make the grade. I just hope this doesn't take the studio down with it. But that's going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to let us know, and we'll see you next time.